You could have the license withdrawn if you were caught selling alcohol to known homosexuals. So if you claimed to be gay, they wouldn't serve you. It's now in that era. You could be arrested for wearing clothes attributed to the gender that is not yours. So if you were a guy dressing as a woman, you could get arrested on the streets, even in the village. So the way people had to behave is they would dress in their drag underneath their clothes, go to the Stonewall and take off the outer layer and flounce around and then put back on their clothing before they left. But often the bar would get raided while they were in drag and they'd get arrested. So they slipped out the revolving door, rushed into the back of the paddy wagon and pulled out arrest victims two by two until over the course of some minutes, he thinks they got about a dozen of them away. They brought them back into his building, carried them to the back stairs, went downstairs and down the hallway and out the back door into the backyard, and they saved a dozen people from arrest that night. Hi, this is Mike Balaban. Welcome to another episode of Bammer Tales. So, once again, I start off with an apology. I've had laryngitis for 3 weeks. My voice is cracking a bit. Thank you for bearing with me. It is as frustrating for me as it may be for you. I'm going to cover some terrain that's a little complicated and tricky and delicate. I want to talk about Stonewall, both the inn and the rebellion that took place in that inn on June 28, 1969, Friday evening. All of the legends and myths and stories that have grown up around the Stonewall Inn in New York City and the Stonewall rebellions that prompted LGBTQ or gay rebellion and revolution in 1969. Let me be very clear. All I intend to do is to separate myth from reality, to share eyewitness accounts and others that have been passed on by people who were there and are willing to have it attributed to them, so as to be distinct from some of the stories that have grown up and have become popular because they play into myths. And I'll be very clear about one. There were 2 marvelous, wonderful, powerful trans women involved with Stonewall and the overall queer rebellion of 1969. Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, both cross-dressing men who saw themselves as women, even in an era when there wasn't quite yet the concept of transitioning fully to a different gender than you were born into. They were sex workers. They were rebels. They stood up and took flack and achieved full volume and got listened to by many and reacted against by others, but they were, as controversial as they may have been, they were powerful central characters in the story of Gay Revolution 1979. Now, what I want to say is some people have tried to credit them with being the fomenting agents, the catalysts for the rebellion at Stonewall that evening. And I have interviewed several people who attended Stonewall and were there multiple evenings, and universally, they make it clear that all of these stories have gained great power when in fact they're not accurate. There was no one catalyst in all likelihood. There were many people involved with Stonewall. And that's one of the things I want to separate here, fact from myth. Number one, Stonewall was one of only about 4 clandestine queer bars in Greenwich Village at that time in June 1969. 3 of them had liquor licenses where you could have the license withdrawn if you were caught selling alcohol to known homosexuals. So if you claimed to be gay, they wouldn't serve you. The fourth one, Stonewall, did not have a license. It was illegal. It was like a speakeasy. And as such, they couldn't be punished, but they really weren't even supposed to be operating. Now, also, back then, you didn't want to be known as queer. You did everything you could to hide it. The bars, such as they were, had either open windows and acted like everything was normal, but they declined to be named as gay bars. They were straight. They were just filled with theatrical people, as they put it. That's the case with Julius's, the institution that serves great burgers that is still around today. There was a sit-in by known homosexuals challenging them that tried to overcome that hurdle. But in the event, they were largely not accepting the name of gay bar. Stonewall was proud to be gay. Not only that, they covered their windows. They were black. Why? Because things that went on inside weren't supposed to. Touching other members of the same sex, dancing with other members of the same sex, drinking alcohol that wasn't legal, playing the jukebox. Now, in that era, you could be arrested for wearing clothes attributed to the gender that is not yours. So if you were a guy dressing as a woman, you could get arrested on the streets, even in the village. So the way people had to behave is they would dress in their drag underneath their clothes, go to the Stonewall and take off the outer layer and flounce around and then put back on their clothing before they left. But often the bar would get raided while they were in drag and they'd get arrested. So Stonewall was an illicit, proud to be underground bar that did everything you weren't supposed to do, often got raided. They were run by the mafia, and the mafia paid off the police. Although rumor has it on the evening of June 28, 1969, the first Stonewall Rebellion evening, they supposedly had not made the payment, not made the drop-off. That might have been why they were raided. They were raided at 10:30 in the evening, which was early, so that they could arrest a few of the bartenders, take them down to the jailhouse, book them, and then release them, and they could go back to work when the crowd showed up after midnight. Now, the other thing about the crowd at Stonewall was that it was known as being a little bit of everything. There are all kinds of stories about it being extremely people of color, extremely trans, or extremely whatever. It wasn't. It was the dregs. It was the place where you went because you could be gay. By and large, the crowd was young, because they were the ones most willing to challenge authority and willing to go into illegal establishments. There were a lot of young men who made money by charging for sex. There were a lot of ethnics, the Latinos, some blacks. And so, unbeknownst to some of the reputation that has developed, the bar was not heavily frequented by people of color or by Latinos or by drag queens. In fact, the mafia policed carefully what the composition of the bar was and limited how many people of color, etc., were admitted each night. So to attribute the Stonewall Rebellion to a bunch of people from any one group is really unreasonable. It looked like any other crowd you would have seen on the street. It wouldn't have been detectable. Now, when the police got there and raided it, they did not expect any pushback. They had never gotten it before. Now, it turns out there were 2 or 3 other bar raids and kind of insurrections at the Compton Cafe in San Francisco, the Black Cat Cafe in LA, and another place in Chicago in the early mid-'60s. But it was way too early. Those things were just one-offs. They didn't take hold. They didn't catch fire. Unlike Stonewall, that happened in 1969, at the end of the hippie era, at the end of the anti-Vietnam War era, at the end of the Black Power era, and the feminist Equal Rights Amendment era, all those political movements were underway, and the last one to get started was the LGBTQ movement, because they were too punished. They were kept underground. They felt fearful. But on the evening when Stonewall erupted, that was the first time where they'd had enough and they weren't going to take it. Some people attribute it to Judy Garland having died and been buried that day, and she was a big icon to a lot of gay men, not to the people who frequented the Stonewall. They could have cared less about Judy Garland. It just so happened that when the police went in to arrest the bartenders and the drag queens and whatever, that they encountered a mood of truculence, of resistance for some reason. And apparently, unlike the reputation that people were throwing Molotov cocktails or throwing parking meters or burning fires, setting fires to the bar, myth versus fact, there were no Molotov cocktails. There were no bricks thrown. In point of fact, the gays inside the bar, when they finally stood up to the police and started rebelling, they threw pennies that are made out of copper, which was a symbol of the cops being on the take at the bar, and their disdain was to throw pennies at them. There was apparently one small attempt to start a fire in a wastebasket at the front of the door outside, but it failed. And other than that, the police ended up being shocked by the rebellion, the resistance. Ultimately, they had to lock themselves inside the bar and call for reinforcements, whereupon everybody outside the bar who was queer began sending word out to all their friends, calling them, come on down. And it grew and grew. And by the way, it grew over the next 3, 4, 5 evenings. It was nonstop. And the village is very filled with crooked streets. They're not parallel to each other. So the queers knew their way around, and when the police were chasing them, they would know how to escape when others might not have. When the police came out at one moment, according to Michaela Griffo and one of the other accounts, there was a rather emotionally unbalanced lesbian who'd been arrested, maybe dressed in male drag, and put in the police car. And they went back in the club to pull out more people. And while she was in there, apparently she slipped out of her handcuffs somehow and managed to get out of the car and started rocking it, trying to tip it over. And when the police came back and encountered her, that's what was the catalyst for all of the disarray and the resistance that began to happen. People began to shout and people began to run around, and the police, that's when they pushed themselves back in the bar and locked the door. As you can see in one of my interviews, Frank Carducci was there that evening in his apartment above the Stonewall, and they looked out the window and they saw this commotion. So they went downstairs to find out what's going on. And they saw a paddy wagon pulled up in front of the rotating door of his apartment building, almost blocking them, but not quite. And that in that car, the police were coming out of the bar and stuffing in arrest victims and then going back in to get more. But Frank and his buddy noticed that the back door, the rear door of the paddy wagon, was ajar. So they slipped out the revolving door, rushed into the back of the paddy wagon, and pulled out arrest victims 2 by 2 until, over the course of some minutes, he thinks they got about a dozen of them away. They brought them back into his building, carried them to the back stairs, went downstairs and down the hallway and out the back door into the backyard, and they saved a dozen people from arrest that night. Eventually, the police came back and realized what was going on. They were hidden and not within sight, so they didn't know that these two were responsible. But they closed the ajar door and continued to go keep arresting people. The bar that is known as Stonewall did not make it beyond 1969. Stonewall Rebellion was June 28th through July 1st or 2nd. By the end of the year, Stonewall had closed. Remember, it was illegal. It had no license. It got in trouble because of the rebellion. So it fell apart. And it did not reopen for 20 more years. In 1990, Jimmy Pisano, a bartender from somewhere else, took over what by that point was a Chinese restaurant or various other iterations and opened a bar which he named New Jimmy's whatever in honor of the bartender named Jimmy who taught him his trade, not as an egotistical a tribute to himself. And after less than a year, he changed the name from New Jimmy's back to the Stonewall Inn. And from 1990 until he died in the late 90s, he kept it going despite losing money every year because of willpower and commitment. He was also supported by his boyfriend. But in 98, Jimmy died of AIDS. His boyfriend continued running it in honor of Jimmy until some point at the end of the century or early 2000s when Jimmy's surviving partner sold the Stonewall Inn to the current owners, and that's the iteration that now exists. So it's only alive because of Jimmy. Now, the AIDS Memorial page on Instagram is a great place to go and read about stories of friends, lovers, people we knew who died of HIV and AIDS. And many of my friends' stories are up on that page. Stuart Armstrong, the founder and manager of that page in Scotland, he felt it was a shame, a travesty, that Jimmy Pesante was never recognized for his hero status in reopening and keeping the Stonewall Bar around. And there, in fact, is a wall of heroes at Stonewall. And he approached their owners and got nowhere, asking them to put Jimmy's name up. In fact, there had been a plaque before the bar was renovated that had Jimmy's name on it, but that was taken down. Stuart asked me, do you have any connections? Could you perhaps see if we can try to find a way to get Jimmy recognized? It took 2 or 3 years. Number one, I had to go through the city council president, Corey Johnson, who I knew, and his chief of staff, now a member of council himself, Eric Botcher, contacted the owners and connected me with them. Then they kind of stonewalled me, no pun intended, and kept giving excuses. And ultimately they said they couldn't put his name up there because it was the decision made once a year by 2 organizations, GLAAD, the Gay and Lesbian Media Organization, and the Imperial Court, which is this kind of dragged 1,600 gallons, organization that has big balls every year, no pun intended. So the Imperial Court and GLAAD voted on these decisions, and they would have to approve it. So they kept passing the buck. And eventually, with the help of the city council president of New York, we got them to review it, to vote on it, and to approve Jimmy Pesante's name on that wall of heroes. Only one problem, it was during COVID. And then the next excuse was, well, we can't get the plaque from China because of supply chain issues. So it took a couple of years before we finally made it happen. And Jimmy Pesante's name as the original owner after the Stonewall closed down, original owner in 1990, who kept that bar going so that it became the institution it is today. Jimmy is now recognized on the wall of his former establishment, and I'm glad to have had a hand in that. The fact that attribution for Marcia and Sylvia for having fomented that rebellion, which in fact appears to have been started by that errant lesbian, they told Michaela Griffo, with whom they were both close, fairly shortly after that evening, that neither one was at the Stonewall Inn at the time the commotion broke out. One apparently arrived much later in the morning, and the other one may not have made it until the next day. So anyone attempting to say that despite all the amazing things that Marcia and Sylvia did, that they were responsible for Stonewall, that's not true. Now, let me give you what they really did that should be praised and emulated and extolled even now, 50, 60 years later. Sylvia and Marcia co-founded the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, STAR, within the year of the Stonewall Rebellion in 1970. It was a gay and gender non-conforming transvestite street activist organization, a radical political collective. It provided housing and support for LGBT youth, homeless LGBT youth, and sex workers in Lower Manhattan. They even bought a 4-story building at one point. And most amazing is that it was funded largely through the sex work that both Marcia and Sylvia did. They were known for their revolutionary, committed actions. And at times they didn't get along with parts of the community because they were so insistent upon what they were doing. But they had a guideline, they had a guidance, and ultimately what they did with STAR was considered groundbreaking for the LGBTQ or queer movement at that time. Remember, in 1969, there were no organizations, no health places to go for health care or housing or whatever. It all had to be invented from scratch. And Marcia and Sylvia were two of the first people to recognize that and to do something about it. So that's my take on Stonewall. It was an amazing evening, and then 4 or 5 evenings all told. It contributed so much to our feeling of self-worth, to the realization that we no longer had to sit back and take all of the guff that we were given by the police and authorities and schools and jobs and whatever. And it began the process of revolution and evolution in LGBTQ rights. A lot of it thanks to Sylvia and Marcia, but equal large part due to the nameless people who showed up at the Stonewall bar and were there for that moment when lightning struck and they took advantage of it. Thank you for listening. It's been a pleasure telling this to you. Another episode of Bammer Talks.